Dave, I'm glad we could join you just minutes after you guys report Q4 numbers. We're not going to hash over all the numbers, but I do want to ask you about the 737 MAX charges. You're taking a number of them and future costs being counted in. The total is now $18.6 billion. Are you pretty confident that's the last of the big charges, or are you being a little conservative here?
I'm as confident as a CEO can be. Let's not talk about the specific buckets of the charges. The most important thing underlying it is, do we believe we can meet the certification timeline that underlies all of that? And the answer is yes. As we looked at that schedule, and as I listened to the FAA and all the constituencies who have an interest in all of this, including the training dimension associated with it, we put together a schedule we think we can make. Not easily. It requires a lot of execution. It requires a lot of discourse, a lot of back and forth with the FAA and the certification process. But we think we've been realistic about that as we laid out this timetable. And we can't do anything more than that.
You know already, and I'm sure you've heard this, some people are saying, look, they're saying mid-year. We're already hearing some fairly encouraging comments from the head of the FAA, as well as those who are involved in the process. And some people are already saying, look, I think he's the new CEO. He's sandbagging. He's throwing out a date later this year, and we can see the MAX back in service sooner than that. What do you think when you hear that?
No, of course not. You can't sandbag in a situation like this. I have to answer to our employees. I have to listen to our employees. I simply have to give them the time they need to do the natural discourse that occurs in a big, complex certification process. And that's what we've provided for. Nothing more, nothing less. So I believe we can do it. And then the only other comment I have to make, and I will always make, I do not and will not control this timeline. So mid-year is what we believe we can do. I appreciate the comments that came from Steve. On the other hand, if he changes those comments in a month, we change our schedule. Simple as that.
Steve Dixon is who you're talking about, the head of the FAA, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But the one question that has come up over the last 3 weeks, you've heard the suggestion from people that, look, they're not going to get the MAX back. Just scrap it all together. And the fundamentals of this program have been questioned. I know from our conversations that bothers you because you believe in this airplane.
Totally.
Why do you believe? Why should people have confidence in the MAX?
If we didn't believe that we were going to field an airplane that was safer than the safest demonstrated airplane that's out there today, we wouldn't do it. That's what the FAA wants. That's what Boeing wants. It is a fundamentally sound airplane. The scrutiny it is getting now, the tests are exhaustive. The documentation is clear. The training recommendations are as robust as they could possibly be. If I didn't believe in all of that process, if our people on the ground didn't believe it, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you today with a schedule like we've laid out.
Steve Udvar-Hazy, a longtime veteran of this industry, chairman of Air Lease Corp, who has said, look, I'm not sure that this plane should remain the 737 MAX. The name should be dropped completely. You've called that idea silly. Why?
Well, I'm not going to market my way out of this, right? So, I love Steve. I was with him a couple of days ago. And he's right in the sense that the MAX has something attached to it today. But again, we believe this airplane is safer than the safest airplane flying today. Every next airplane has to be that way. It has to be that way for Boeing. It has to be that way for our competitors. So what we call it, trying to relabel it, trying to merchandise that, no. This plane will recover with a flying public when airplane pilots step on it, fly it, like it. And by the way, based on all the test flights we've had to date, which are many, they do. So as all those pilots return, so will passengers.
Still no guidance for 2020, and you won't be giving that until you have certainty in terms of MAX production. You can say, okay, we know in this quarter we'll build this many. But firing up that assembly line is not as simple as saying, let's go. It's going to take some time to wake it up, correct?
Exactly. And the plan that we've laid out, the costs that we have described that amount to the numbers that you accurately portrayed, provide for a very steady, one-at-a-time delivery. Remember, we emptied the line.
Yeah, it's shut down. It's quiet right now.
So we don't just start it up and we're all of a sudden delivering airplanes. We started up one station at a time. We made the decision to keep our employees so that the employees who start back up on that line start warm. That's the job they were doing. That's the job they will do. All in the name of stability, safety. We're going to do this one airplane at a time.
Joe, you've got a question here for Dave?
I do. So, Dave, recently there was another software glitch that was spotted, and there seem to be two schools of thought on more pilot involvement or more automated systems for commercial airliners. And I think the president weighed in, nobody flies anymore. Boeing seemed to even double down on going to more automated systems. Is that still the current thinking, that you want to move further and further away from the pilot having as much influence on the flight of the plane?
Yeah, that's a very complex subject, and it's a very important one. And I would suggest, with respect to every next new airplane post the recertification of this airplane, that decision and the guidance and the regulations that come out of the FAA are going to have to answer that question. It's sort of clear to me that more automation will be required as we move forward to prevent situations like this that occurred. But I'm not completely sold on that. There is a big school that believes more flying time, more experience is in the best interest of the flying public. So I'm not going to answer that question too decisively. I think I know which direction it's going, but we're going to have to work very closely with the global regulators to answer it before the next airplane is developed.
Hey, Dave, I'm not sure I understood the answer. I realize you can't answer all of it right now, but it sounded to me like you were leaning towards more automation because of what happened in this situation. But I'd argue the automation is what caused this to begin with. It could have been pilot problems on top of that, but it was the MCAS system that started the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that conclusion, Becky. And I don't want to answer the big question about how much pilots should fly or not on the basis of the MCAS experience in those instances. In those instances, we wish MCAS was different, and it didn't add to the complexity to that boundary condition that caused the problem. So we wish that hadn't happened, and the changes that we've made to the flight control system now and being certified today would not have created that instance. So I don't want to infer that it was automation that caused those instances. I think in those cases, we didn't get it right in a boundary condition that some inexperienced pilots had to deal with. That's a Boeing problem and a very specific and discrete problem.
Hey, Dave, to the extent that investors and analysts are going to be watching you today, looking through these numbers, listening to this interview, and saying, effectively, do I trust this guy? Do I trust the numbers he's putting out? Not that the numbers are inaccurate, but the confidence that he has or doesn't have in when things are going to happen or not going to happen. My question to you is, what things changed for you? What were the lessons since, frankly, we saw you on our air back in November, and you had confidence in your predecessor and in the expectations of when this plane was going to get back in the air?
Andrew, listen, it's a great question. It's a question that hits me head on every time I'm with any audience, internal or external. You, the media, my customers, our employees, they'll judge me every step of the way here. I'm not going to predict it's going to be perfect. But what I will do is I will put realism into every one of our assessments every step of the way, and I will listen to everybody that's involved directly in the process. And as I listen and I help them resolve the anxieties they may have at any point in time during that process, everybody will gain confidence. I believe that. And we do need confidence as we launch this airplane. But the underlying engineering of the airplane, the demonstrated performance, outside that one moment where boundary conditions were not provided for, I believe in this airplane. I believe in the engineering of it. I believe in all the fundamentals. And we can get this exactly right. And as I said before, if we didn't believe, or if anybody in this process didn't believe we were going to field an airplane that's safer than any airplane in the sky, we wouldn't do it.
Hey, Dave, how would you...
Dave, I have to ask you...
Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, guys.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, Dave, how would you characterize the current relationships with your customers and the major carriers? Is it cordial? Is it Are they asking for more information? Or do you speak to them a lot? Do you dread speaking? I mean, where does it stand right now with how that's going with all your biggest customers?
Well, listen, I do know them, and I've known them for quite some time, and I would never describe our discussions today as cordial. They are very direct, but they are incredibly supportive of the Boeing company and the products that we field. So they just want us to get back on track. They simply want us to get back where production's stable, predictable. They get their airplanes exactly when they need them. I think we have handled that discussion as well as it could be handled, maybe with not quite as much transparency. And I think getting back to Andrew's question, I think transparency of the lessons I've learned over the last year, that is where Boeing fell short. And we will not fall short on that subject under my leadership. It will be uncomfortable, but we will be transparent on every subject, whether it's training, whether it's the certification process, everything along the way. Leadership, culture, all those things are fair game. I get it. But you'll know what I know.
Dave, let me ask you about culture, because when you saw those emails, and you've known about the emails, but when you released them, I think the public looked at this and they said, look, you've got some employees who are calling the MAX a plane designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys. I wouldn't fly on it. What was your reaction the first time you saw those messages?
Stomach turned, just like yours would, just like anybody's would. So I don't want this to get confused. So I believe that that kind of language and the IMs that were disclosed, and I wish they'd been disclosed inside the company a long time ago, not while we're in the midst of recovery 3 years later. That language is horrible. It existed. Trying to indict the rest of the Boeing culture on the basis of those few, I won't go that far, but somehow, some way, leadership allowed that to happen. That's unacceptable, and it can't be allowed to happen in the future. And anybody who sees it has to be willing to raise their hand, talk to the leadership of the company, and then we have to be decisive about it.
I know Becky's got a few last questions before we wrap this up. Becky, go ahead.
Well, just a follow-up on that, Dave. I mean, you were chairman at the time. When did you find out about the messages, and was it Dennis Muhlenberg's decision alone to not release those messages sooner?
Becky, we found out way too late. There was only one moment in time that if we had found out, we all would have done something, and that is the day it was written. So it's the who found out later, and every one of us involved in every step of that process believes we found out too late. We agree with all of that. And were we as transparent as we needed to be when we did find out? No. On the other hand, none of that really matters relative to the culture and the safety process we employ. We had to find out about that the day it was written. And then we had to take action quickly so that then we would have been ahead of all of this. And maybe we would have a different recommendation with respect to training. Anyway, I can't rewrite history. I wish I could. But I think that's the point.
One last question here, Dave. The coronavirus, as it continues to spread here. Are you concerned at all about a long-term impact in terms of, A, travel to China, which is the world's largest market, and B, as they look into the future about ordering more aircraft? You haven't had an order from China since 2017. Does this have any lasting impact?
Yeah, I don't think so. First, I'm sorry for what's going on. I will say the experience with SARS in a much earlier time frame and the protocols that were established, I believe, will contain this at a much faster rate than it would have otherwise contained it without that experience. And I believe all those protocols will get perfected as we deal with this. So everybody's doing everything they can to support those protocols, to limit ultimately the number of people affected. But I don't believe it'll have a long-term effect. It didn't before, and I don't believe it will going forward.
And with the China trade deal, at least phase one, close to being finalized, are you optimistic you may get an order finally from China?
Yes, I am. I'm very optimistic.
Will we see it this year, likely?
I'm not going to predict that because that's up to the Chinese. We will do everything in our power to get that order, to reestablish the great relationship that we have, and we do. And I believe their need for aircraft is significant. So, yes, I think the trade deal will lead to some significant orders.
Dave Calhoun, President and CEO of Boeing, joining us first on CNBC just moments after the company releases Q4 earnings, a loss of $233. But it's the charges and the cost of the MAX that's going to get a lot of attention today.